7th, 1983, headline New York Times, secrecy in a dismissal by Stanford fuels academic freedom dispute. I know. I almost yawned, too, because I didn't know what was underneath. Listen to this. Stanford University's expulsion of a graduate student on the basis of a secret report by faculty members who investigated his anthropological work in China, and that's Red China, has touched off a dispute about academic freedom. Well, this story starts out with an earthquake and works up to a climax. Stephen Mosher, on one of these academic whoop-de-doos, where he does anthropological work in China towards a doctoral degree. He was in mainland China. In a little village, apparently some cosmic wave of goodwill between America and the Communist Chinese government resulted in some scholars getting some spots that they really should want, and not just a quick tour of, water skiing across the big cities of China, but really embedding oneself into the gut work of the mainland. Steve Mosher did. He stayed there for almost a year. He emerged with revelations like this, and I quote from the New York Times. It says, in a book, Broken Earth, The Rural Chinese, to be published in September, Mr. Mosher paints a portrait of apathy, corruption, and poverty among China's peasants and village officials. He also describes, as he did in the article published in Taiwan, at Stanford, they didn't like that Mr. Mosher published articles in Taiwan, wrote for magazines, and was even contemplating a book. Well, he also describes a campaign in his village in the spring of 1980, this is in mainland China, to force abortions on pregnant women who were not permitted to have children under Peking's strict birth control rules. At a family planning meeting he attended, he wrote, a local official told the pregnant women, none of you have any choice in this matter. The two of you who are 8 or 9 months pregnant will have a cesarean, Mr. Mosher quotes the official as saying. The rest of you will have a shot that will cause you to abort. In a nearby village, Mr. Mosher asserted a woman 7 months pregnant who had no sons had an ordered abortion and was found to have been carrying twin boys. The woman's husband, Mr. Mosher wrote, went into a fury. Went to the home of the official who had ordered the abortion. Seizing that man's 2 sons, aged 8 and 10, he wrote, he heaved them into the courtyard well and then leaped in himself. All 3 drowned. Steve Mosher, first question is selfish. I've got to know, how is the American media treating you? You have damaged the image of communism in China more than anybody else. Fox Butterfield of the New York Times may get a wry smile out of that. He did not do a bad job either, but he would be the first to admit that he was a New York Times correspondent in the big cities, Peking and so forth, maybe an occasional trip to the interior. You, speaking fluent Cantonese, stayed for a year in that Cantonese village. So Fox Butterfield, I'm sure, would not want to compete for the title of having been the most familiar American scholar to have done the most damage in a book to the image of communism in China. How are my colleagues treating you?
Well, I feel I'm being treated much better by the American media than I have been treated for the last 2.5 years by the Stanford professors who formerly served on my dissertation committee.
Is the media, you can tell whether, I remember from being single, I could tell whether she wanted to see me again 10 minutes into the date. You could tell which way they're pulling, the attitudes. Can you tell that, is the press as overjoyed as I am to see communist China betrayed as what you betrayed it as, or is there resentment that you sort of splashed ink on their favorite icon?
Well, I think you get both reactions, but I have been heartened to see that a lot of people who formerly believed that the Chinese Communist Party had created a new China, after reading my book, have stopped, taken a second look, and discovered that things aren't as nice in Communist China as they had been led to believe.
Well, I will say, in case you are taking this broadcast down in shorthand, circle this passage right here because I want you to notice it tomorrow. One who is mature and sophisticated hesitates to hope that something will happen that he desires as much as the collapse of a tyranny from within. But there is fuel inside Stephen Mosher's book. Maybe he will inert that fuel. Maybe he'll say, forget it, Barry, it's not going to happen. But as you read, as I have read, Broken Earth, the rural Chinese, you begin to perk up a little bit and say, hey, maybe, just maybe, the long-suffering Chinese people will get an almost bloodless break if this incredible bureaucracy that's strangulating them collapses. When we get back together, I want to speculate, and then we'll get down to nothing but fact. If instead of exposing the forced abortion policy of the Chinese Communist government, if Steve Mosher had been in South Africa and found a government program there to force the abortion of black women, would Stanford University have still voted 17 to nothing to deny him his PhD? First, I cannot imagine any American, any Chinese, any European, I can't imagine anybody on the planet Earth reading Steve Mosher's book, Broken Earth, The Rural Chinese, looking at his credentials and the time that he spent in that little Chinese village doing his homework, and the fact that he speaks fluent Cantonese, I can't imagine anybody wanting to say, Mr. Mosher, you have slandered the Chinese people's revolution, you have exaggerated, you have ignored the other side. It's just too much. There is just too much to... It makes you feel almost sorry for the Chinese communists because they, in fact, are suffering along with that billion-plus Chinese population. Broken Earth, the rural Chinese.
Goes back to 1979. Things happened very quickly in the first few months of that year. The United States and the People's Republic of China established diplomatic relations. A cultural exchange agreement was signed. I was sent by the United States to the PRC to work in a little village in the southernmost province of Guangdong to do something that no Westerner had been allowed to do since the revolution, since 1949. That is, to live with the villagers, to share their lives, to work in the fields with them, and to find out how it went with them under communism, what their lives were like, what changes had been wrought in the countryside, changes for the good and changes for the bad, to try to sum up the achievements and the disappointments of the Chinese Revolution for the peasantry.
And they let you into this tiny little town, knowing that you spoke the dialect that well?
I had a unique opportunity to go to China and to work and live in this village without any surveillance by Chinese officialdom whatsoever.
That's incredible. It's like saying I had permission to walk through that monsoon without getting wet.
Well, let me note in passing that no one has been allowed to do a similar study in the Soviet Union in its entire 65 years of existence. I think what happened was that 1979-1980 was a very peculiar time in China. Deng Xiaoping was in a power struggle with Hua Guofeng that he later won. He was anxious to establish ties with the United States, and he conceded for 1 year the right to Americans to send someone to the villages to find out what life was really like. In retrospect, I think it was an incredible blunder of the Chinese bureaucracy in Peking not to send someone with me to the village. From their point of view, of course, from my point of view, it was a godsend, because had an official been there, the peasants wouldn't have opened up to me. They would have been frightened. They would have been afraid to reveal what their lives were truly like. They would have cleaved much more closely to the official line. As it was, I had a home in the village, my own home. I was able to go over to my neighbors' homes in the evening and drink tea with them. They could come over to my home and have lunch with me. I had a van when I was in the village. I was able to drive around the countryside, visit other villages. I enjoyed total access to this village and surrounding villages. I had been in China. I'd been in this village only a few days when I went up to the commune seat to talk to local officials about some commune-run industries. We'd had a good meeting that day. It lasted for a couple hours, and they told me a lot about how the commune industries worked and what they produced, and yet they tended to shy away from discussions of problems. But as I was leaving, an official came up to me and said, "You ought to drop by some evening, and we can have a longer chat." And I saw at once there was something unusual in that invitation, so the next night I took him up on it. That time I didn't have a van, I just had a bicycle, so I waited until after dark. I got on my bicycle and went over to his house.
Why did you have to wait until after dark?
Well, I thought it best. You see, I just arrived in China. I didn't know what was going to happen.
You were not sure whether it's safe to visit him.
I thought it would be safer for him, certainly if I went after dark.
Okay.
I arrived about 8 o'clock. I stayed there until 1 o'clock in the morning. And I was exposed to an amazing, simply amazing, an eye-opening account of what life had really been like in China for the past 30 years. We talked about the Great Leap Forward. We talked about the famine that the Great Leap Forward had visited upon the countryside in 1960 and 61. We talked about the Red Guards and the Cultural Revolution, and I got the inside story of what had happened in that area. I found out that the local enterprises that officials had told me the day before all made a profit actually ran mostly at a loss, that there were a lot of problems in personnel, a lot of problems with worker absenteeism and so forth. That first meeting really opened up new vistas for me. And I followed. After that, I made other contacts. As my stay in the village lengthened, I was able to make friends out of acquaintances and to find out really the truth about rural China.
You must have taken some kind of attitude in with you. The communist China is bad, communist China is great. What was your attitude going in?
I went into China believing that the Chinese communists had improved the lives of the peasantry. You see, I had no reason not to believe what Peking had been saying for the last 30 years was true, because there was no contradictory evidence. No one else had been there. Besides the books and brochures published by Peking, and besides the books published by tourists and Mao apologists, I had nothing to go on. So I assumed, going into China, that conditions for the peasantry had improved.
Hold it.
Well, I think the word xenophobia applies to Peking officials who are concerned that the truth about China doesn't come out, but it certainly doesn't apply to the Chinese people. They're very friendly, open, outgoing people, as long as they're left alone by their government. And the situation I walked into in the village, I created a sensation. I walked into the village, and they all poured out of their homes to look at this sandy-haired, blue-eyed Caucasian. But very shortly after that, I was able to make friends and able to begin to share their lives. They were pleased, not frightened that I could speak the language. Every time I opened my mouth, they would turn to each other and say, which means he knows how to speak Cantonese, as if it were astonishing that someone who looks so different than they...
Well, it is astonishing.
Could speak the same as they spoke.
How'd you learn such good Cantonese?
I lived in Hong Kong for a year in 1975 and 76 with a Cantonese family. Cantonese is the language of Hong Kong. And I continued 1977, 78, before going to China, to study Cantonese. And so by the time I arrived in China, for the first time in March of that year, and then later that year began my research in that village, I was able to speak Cantonese and dispense with an interpreter from the very beginning. Well, the Chinese are known as a very industrious people, and rightly so, because the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Chinese wherever they've gone, the American Chinese, Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Chinese in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, have been economically successful, and they're successful by dint of hard work. I recall one day I went out in the fields with them. In the village, I ate with the peasants and worked with the peasants. And on that day, I got to collective headquarters early, but the workers didn't show up and didn't get out into the fields until about 8 o'clock. Now, that's late for a farm anywhere. We worked until about 11 and then threw in the towel until the afternoon. We went in the afternoon from 2 to 5. Well, they did a lot more work that day than what they did on the collective fields. They were up before dawn, taking care of their own garden plots, At noon, the women were busy preparing meals and washing clothes, and in the evening, the chores continued. But the Chinese peasants, as they say themselves, were sluggish as worms on the collective fields, and they were energetic as dragons when working on their own plots for their own family.
Dr. Halberg.
There's a saying behind the Iron Curtain. I just printed it recently, that we will pretend that we work. They pretend that they pay us. I'm sorry, that's the way it goes. Oh. They pretend that they pay us, and we will pretend that we work.
That's it exactly. Well, they said for the cadres, and this is really an inside joke, because it depends on the Chinese language. For the cadres,
what are the organizations? What are the cadres?
Cadres are Chinese officials. The sort of in-term in sinology in the field of Chinese studies is cadres. That simply means a government official, someone employed by the government, usually in a position of power and authority.
Cadre in the European communist hierarchy means somebody who is part and parcel of the communist machine, the political machine.
Right.
That's
it has really two meanings.
This is what it means in the European communist terminology.
So sometimes in China, a cadre is any one of the 25 million people who are employed by the government in that big bureaucracy that controls China. Sometimes it just means the people in control.
Okay, so back to the four modernizations now.
For cadres, the four modernizations mean buying a TV set, buying a tape recorder, buying a clock, and what was the fourth one?
And calculator.
Buying a calculator. Mm-hmm. And for ordinary people, the four modernizations being seeing people hearing people talk about modernization, seeing other people modernize, thinking about modernization, and hoping for modernization.
Witnessing modernization from afar, yeah. But they're at least not afraid to joke about their government when you broke through.
Well, no one would go to the local party headquarters and tell this joke. I mean, they would tell it. They would tell it in the privacy of their own homes, and when the family gates were locked and when there were no officials present. Then they would open up.
Talk about the isolation of the normal American, what the regime does to keep him from visiting the Chinese and the Chinese from visiting him.
Well, I think a lot of American tourists fool themselves in thinking that when they go to China, what they see is China. What they're actually seeing has no more resemblance to the real China than agricultural pavilions at a state fair resemble a farm. They see not China, but model communes, not Chinese factories, but model factories, not Chinese schools, but model schools. And, of course, there's always the museums and the temples and other relics from historical times. But they follow a very narrow path from city to city. And they can spend up to 2 weeks and a lot of money in China and come out of China with impressions that are not fact, but that are created deliberately by the rulers in Peking.
Chinese.
Marco Polo has a tremendous merit that never should be overlooked, that he brought out the spaghetti and the macaroni of China and gave it to the world, both to Europe and America.
Well, Marco Polo may have brought the macaroni and spaghetti, but Steve Mosher cut out the bologna. And I think in our day, there's a vastly greater contribution.
Sure. Yeah.
You talked about sex and relationships between men and women. I never believed it until I read it from you. I thought it was cheap shot, anti-communist propaganda.
What is that?
The way the Communist Party in China regulates or tries to regulate, and apparently they succeed, the relationship between men and women.
I don't think that they're allowed to marry before they're about 25
Look,
years old.
Why do we have to think? Here's a man who spent a year there.
I think the Chinese Communist Party is afraid of any uncontrolled releases of energy, and I think releases of sexual energy are included under that. the party would like everyone to commit themselves to its line, would like them to devote all their energies to production, and would like them to get up in the morning, go to work, come home, get off work, come home, and go to bed, keep regular hours, and do nothing not permitted by the party. Under the birth control program, the age in marriage has been raised to 25 for women, 26 for men. So what does this do in the countryside? This means that people are sexually mature for nearly a decade before they can get permission from the Chinese Communist Party to wed. Well, I get the party would like everyone to remain chaste during that period. It doesn't happen. When I drove along village roads in the evening, I could see, parked along the side of the road, pairs of bikes at intervals. And each pair of bikes represented a couple that was off, away from the road, sitting alongside a fish pond somewhere, sitting under a mulberry tree, on a date, holding hands, talking, kissing.
And that's their equivalent of the drive-in theater.
That's all they've got. In the commune that I lived in, which had a population of 80,000 people, there was only one movie theater, and tickets were hard to get. And older villages are still very prudish, still very conservative, where it comes to relationships between the sexes. Men and women do not communicate very much in the village. I went to collective meetings and found the women sitting on one side of the room and the men sitting on the other. They didn't talk to each other very much. And so young people have a very difficult time making friends of members of the opposite sex, and they usually have to go through intermediaries. And as I say, they usually have to meet after dark away from the village, away from their elders, so that no one will see them. But they do meet.
It's one thing for a country to warn its people not to have dealings with foreigners. I was surprised to see inside your book that the Chinese communists are so open about it. I mean, there was no attempt to keep the foreigners from realizing that the people were instructed not to deal with them. A meeting that I didn't dream anybody ever went to. I thought this was strictly made in Hollywood, not observed in mainland China. Inside Now Broken Earth by Stephen W. Mosher. Comrades, this cadre man started. Under the direction of the Guangdong Provincial Communist Party Committee, and nobody was quiet. They were talking to each other. So he waited till they got quiet and then started again. Comrades, under the direction of the Guangdong Provincial Communist Party Committee, the local prefectural party committee has determined that we will hold a movement. The criticize 1, hit 2, rectify 3. Say that in Chinese.
EPR da, 三番.
This spring, they're going to hold that hit 1 hit, 2 rectify, criticize 1, hit 2, rectify 3. I got to give Communist China credit. They got the most marvelous names for their program.
Chinese is a language that lends itself to sloganizing.
The 100 flowers blooming and the great leaps forward. I would almost have a defunct steel mill in my backyard if I could only think it was part of a great leap forward. And in Chinese, it's even more poetic. Anyhow, we're going to have this criticize 1, hit 2, rectify 3 movement this spring throughout the towns and villages of our district. We must thoroughly criticize the Gang of Four's anti-revolutionary revisionist line. We must strike a blow against class enemies and their destructive activities and strike down embezzlers, thieves, speculators, and all illegal capitalist elements. And finally, we must rectify the free peasant markets, rectify commune and brigade cooperative enterprises, and rectify enterprise management practices. The 11th Party Congress has set out this line, and we must ensure that the will of the dictatorship of the proletariat is carried out at the basic levels of government. Every Communist Party member, revolutionary cadre, proletarian worker, poor and lower middle peasant, and revolutionary intellectual must wholeheartedly participate in this people's war to criticize, strike down, and rectify. Now, I can't believe it. Nobody would say that. Nobody would write that. Nobody would think that. Nobody would feel that. And if they did, nobody would listen to it.
Well, imagine listening to it every week, every year, for 30 years. Now, you cannot not attend these meetings. What you can do is when you're at the meetings, you can talk to your neighbors. You can simply sit there with your eyes closed and rest. And you can do anything else to keep your mind off the sloganizing that's going on. Because these slogans, this isn't real language. There's no feeling in these directives. And they simply go over the peasants' heads without having any effect at all.
The falling away from communist ideology is revealingly decried by PRC propagandists as a loss of faith. Explain what PRC is, Stephen.
The People's Republic of China,
okay.
Shorthand.
Yeah. Just as Western religions demand of believers that they give their hearts to God, so does the Chinese Communist Party require of youth that they give over their heart to the party. But youth have lost confidence in the Communist Party, seeing party members at all levels motivated more by self-interest than by a desire to serve the people. And they no longer believe in the socialist system, whose much vaunted superiority seems to exist only in the Empyrean realm of theory. Even Shanghai's Wen Huibao, that's a newspaper, admitted in December 1980 that certain youth are of the opinion that Marxism is already old-fashioned backwards. If capitalism is so corrupt and is bound for extinction, the students were required as asking, then why is production in capitalist countries steadily increasing? And if socialism is relatively superior, then why is China still undeveloped after 30 years of socialism? That's
Chinese was from a young woman who graduated from a college in Yunnan, a province very close to Burma, Southeast Asia. She said, I see hope. I see hope because all of my friends, and she was around 30, all of my friends are now lower and middle-level bureaucrats. None of them believe in communism. All of them believe that basic and far-reaching reforms have to be carried out before China can modernize, before the people can improve their standard of living. And when they get into power, she said to me, they'll change things. Mm. Well, I think that Peking would have been unhappy with me, whatever I did after I left China, because I had simply found out too much. But they were particularly disturbed by the fact that after I left China, I published material on their birth control campaign, material which made it clear that in the Chinese countryside where I lived, women were being coerced to have abortions in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy.
That's infanticide in some cases.
When is a baby capable of living outside the womb?
If they aborted a woman in her 9th month with cesarean section, I'm not an obstetrician, but that seems like the infanticide to me.
I believe so, because that child is capable of surviving outside the womb, and many the fetuses that are 8 months along or even 7 months along have a good shot at survival. But I can give you an example that's even more a direct case of infanticide. There were some women who were nearly to term when they were sent to the commune meetings. Well, they feared having their child aborted that close to term, rightly so, because it's a very serious operation. And they said, after bowing to this pressure they were subject to from cadres, they said to the cadres, well, look, go ahead and take the baby, but wait until I deliver it naturally. And so what the officials did was, as soon as the labor pains began, they would give these women injections into the womb, injections of a poison that killed the fetus. And when the child was born, it was born dead or dying. Now that's what I call officially sanctioned infanticide.
And Peking kept word of this from the outside world successfully until Stephen Mosher of Stanford University got to that Cantonese village?
Yes. You see, it all happened very suddenly. In the early 70s, China was still very lackadaisical about birth control. It was only in 1979, 1980 that they really began to tighten up. And there had been a few scattered reports, people escaping to Hong Kong and saying, look, these sorts of things are going on in the Canton Delta. But it was only after I came out as a first-hand eyewitness to these abortions, to to these atrocities. And it was only after I came out with pictorial evidence, I took photographs of women being prepared for late abortions, that there was no longer any question but that such barbarities were occurring.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the special outrage. By the way, where did you hear the story of the husband whose wife was forced to have an abortion and then learned that she'd been carrying twin sons, and who went to the Chinese communist official who ordered the abortions and took his sons and threw them into a well and plunged in after them, and they all three drowned?
That occurred in the commune next to mine. I'd rather not reveal the name for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm. But you have no reason to doubt that as a true
No, that happened. And that happened when I was there.
Why are the Chinese so much more appreciative of men, sons, than women, daughters? I mean, I guess you can leave off the qualifying adjective. Why are sons so much more important than daughters to them?
Basically for economic reasons. The Chinese traditionally have always valued sons over daughters, and what's behind that is the fact that daughters, when they reach the age of 20, or now it's 25, marry out and leave their parents and go to live with their husband's family, whereas sons, when they grow up and reach maturity, bring brides in and stay with their parents, most importantly, when their parents are in old age, and support them. So sons, in effect, are the only social security system that peasants have in the countryside. The collective doesn't give them anything in the way of a pension, so they have to rely on sons. If you have a son, then you're going to be safe and well-fed in your old age. If you have only daughters, when your daughters leave, you're going to be thrown back on your own resources. And whether you're 60, 65, or 70, that means you have to keep working. You have to keep working in the fields until you die. Well, as you know, I was expelled this past February.
What did they object to? What was the actual accusation that they raised against you? They said, in order to expel somebody, especially from an American university, some very serious reason has to be raised. I mean...
Or some ostensible
reason. I mean, something that sounds plausible to the rest of the university.
There are two explanations. There's the real explanation, and then there's Stanford's explanation. The real explanation, the true explanation, is that I published material on mainland China's birth control campaign that angered Peking and that upset American scholars, including those at Stanford, who were concerned about the future of the exchange program, who, in short, were concerned about their own access to China.
I understand. Yeah.
And there's Stanford's explanation, which is that while I was in China, and this explanation, these accusations are based on, in fact, copied from Peking's accusations, that while I was in China, I engaged in various kinds of unspecified, illegal, and quote, quote, unethical activity.
Such as?
Well, the allegations are endless. Peking has, for the past 2.5 years, been repeating a number of accusations against me, trying to destroy my professional reputation. They convinced at least the anthropology department at Stanford, or I guess it's better to say that the anthropology department at Stanford was predisposed to believe these allegations because they were already upset at me for publishing material on the birth control campaign. When I published that material, what shocked me more than anything was that no one came back to me and expressed concern about the Chinese peasant women who were being forced to undergo abortions. What they said was, well, you published the material at the wrong time. You should have waited. You published it in the wrong place. You should have gone to an obscure scholarly journal somewhere where it wouldn't upset Peking.
Well, that's what I asked much earlier in this broadcast, in a combination of political anger and political jest. I think I'd like to introduce as a whole new question with a straight face. If indeed you had discovered in South Africa that the South African regime was forcing black women to have pregnancies in their 7th, 8th, and 9th months, and if you had published that exactly the way you published what you found of that nature inside communist China, with the anthropology department at Stanford have found the same anger in their hearts against you? Would they have taken the same sanctions against you?
Well, I think to ask that question is to answer it. I think I not only would have got my Ph.D., I probably would have got an honorary degree from several other liberal institutions around the country.
They would have kept a building on that campus named Stanford Hall, but they'd have changed the name to Mosher University, I'm sure.
Well, they might not have gone that far, but they would have been pleased. They would have been ecstatic, because my research in that case would have confirmed their own biases. Well, the situation now is precisely the reverse. My research challenges presuppositions, preconceptions they've held about the mainland Chinese regime these 30 years, and they're unhappy about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm trying to understand it. You see, to me, I'm a lifelong academician, and I know as much about academic intrigue and undercutting as the next guy. But I tell you, there's some missing link, something that's missing as I'm listening to you. Something, they usually don't go to this end. They don't go to this end of making a public spectacle of you, because they don't like to make a public spectacle of themselves. So the fact that they're making a public spectacle of themselves, there's something else there that I cannot put my finger on as I'm talking.
But that's the point. You see, Stanford conducted its investigation in secret. It held the final hearing at which they decided to expel me behind closed doors. Stanford did not want, and does not want, that report that they marked secret to go into the public domain, because I argue they don't want to take responsibility for the allegations it contained. So Stanford didn't go to the media. After I was expelled, I felt I had no choice but to take my case to the media, take my case to the American people, and let them judge for themselves.
Dr. Hallberg, consider this. You are now Stanford University. You have tentacles around the world. All big universities do. Your research, but now, which excites you more now? Your pipeline into communist China, or your pipeline to Baja California? Yes. Nothing to me is missing, because I understand Peking telling Stanford University, look, we want Mr. Mosher's head marinated in soy sauce preferably, but any way you choose to deliver it will be acceptable. And Stanford University.
It's very different.
In other words, you're saying that you have trouble with the concept that Stanford University would buckle that easily under Chinese communist pressure.
Yes.
Hold it. Did see fat Chinese in China. Tell us who they were.
Well, I didn't see very many fat Chinese in the villages. The village men at best attained a sort of stringy robustness, very slender. But officials, especially commune level and higher officials, county officials, provincial officials, ate much better than the peasantry and carried, in many cases, extra pounds.
How was the food from your point of view? In my little Chinese books, as I was beginning to study, I kept seeing reference to a food called congee, C-O-N-G-E-E, and I always wondered what that was. It sounds great.
Well, it's a kind of rice porridge, and whether it's good or not depends on what you put into it. The way Chinese peasants in mainland China eat it, which is with nothing in it, it's a bland food, and it's hard to get down unless you're hungry. I had trouble with the food. See, I had gone into the village, naive idealist that I was, thinking that I was going to live the lifestyle of the peasants. And one of the things I wanted to do was to share their diet. And so for the first month I was in the village, I ate mostly nothing but rice and salted vegetables. Fish or meat was only rarely appeared on my table. Well, by the end of the month, I was falling ill, frequently falling ill. Small illnesses, nothing major, but enough to tell me that my system was in need of maybe a little more nutrition. And so I went out and did something that my neighbors couldn't afford to do. Felt a little guilty about it at the time. I spent some extra money, went to the local rural market and purchased eggs and extra pork rations. And so I supplemented my diet that way. There haven't been free markets in China all the time since 1949. They were closed down by Mao. The Great Leap Forward in the Great Proletarian Culture Revolution, 1966 to 1976. And when he closed them down, he also closed off about a third of the income of the Chinese peasantry, because they used to be able to raise chickens and pigs and take them to the markets. When they were closed down, they lost that income. Well, Deng Xiaoping has reopened those markets, and so the peasants are maybe a little better off than they were under Mao. That's why they like Deng, and that's why they don't like Mao. It's difficult to say at this point. It's very difficult for me as an individual to take on an institution like Stanford with an endowment of $700 million and 20 lawyers on its staff. But I am appealing, and I will continue to fight. I'm not going to walk away from this.
Now,
I'm Barry Farber. Richard Grenier gives us the Marrakesh 1-2, universally acclaimed from coast to coast. Some people call him the new Mark Twain because of that book. Political writer, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been engaged for months now on a cover story on the United Nations for Harper's Magazine. His book, The Marrakesh 1-2, has been nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award. I remember Richard Grenier as the man who nonviolently bombed Gandhi and left a smoking crater. Paul Gershman, his counselor to Ambassador Kirkpatrick, Gene Kirkpatrick. He's the United States representative in the 3rd Committee in the General Assembly, but I remember him back in the days when we used to do all kinds of mud wrestling with Carl Gershman because he was the nicest socialist anybody knew. And he seemed to like free countries and free governments and free things. And I'm overjoyed to meet Carl Gershman on active duty again. Gentlemen, it's now been said, not by rednecks, not by haters, not by know-nothings, not by malcontents, and not by emotionally short-fused people. It has now been said by a United States delegate to the United Nations. He said it in different words, but it amounted to, if you don't like it, get the hell out. And I can't help but wonder why Charles Lichtenstein or Steen, how does he say it? Because I like to get Steen. Okay. Don't be angry. I don't, fielder's choice. Everybody's got a civil right to pronounce S-T-E-I-N whichever way he pleases. Lichtenstein. What is the, not official explanation, but what is the real explanation for his having done that? United Nations delegates 3rd, 4th, and 5th down the line don't talk except to wish the Albanian delegate quick recovery from the gout. I mean, how in the world does Charles Lichtenstein come on television and say, if you don't like it here, get out? I would know and love the UN deny that, Carl?
Well, Barry, I think the statement was certainly an important one, but I wouldn't read into it what you've just said. In the first place, he's a very important member of the U.S. delegation. He's been Ambassador Kirkpatrick's alternate in the Security Council and has made some major addresses for the U.S. delegation in the Security Council. And he's also the United States representative to the Host Country Committee, which is the body that was meeting yesterday when he said this. Now, we are the host country since the United Nations is located in the United States. And what the Host Country Committee, the business of the Host Country Committee is to take care of all the housekeeping matters of the United Nations, parking tickets, housing problems, education. Some of these problems get terribly controversial when you have countries represented in the United Nations, and therefore having representatives in this country, such as Libya, the PLO, the Soviet Union, Cuba, North Korea, and what have you. So obviously you have the potential for a lot of problems here. Now, and there are constant complaints. I don't know how many times you may have seen diplomats who double park and then claim diplomatic immunity and not paying the tickets. Mayor Koch has actually rounded up some diplomats' cars with the driver still in it when they've been double parked in front of Bloomingdale's. And these are constant problems which get taken up in the Host Country Committee. And then yesterday, the Soviet delegate came into the committee echoing what Tass had said the day before, that in fact we had violated our obligations as the host country in the whole affair over Gromyko's cancellation of his visit to come to the United States for the General Assembly.
I don't mind them getting parking places. that I can't get, and I don't mind them double parking in places that nobody's supposed to get. But when afterward they still think they got the right to swim at Glen Cove, that's the end.
Well, I think it's important just to put Ambassador Lichtenstein's statement in its proper context, which is to say, he came in there, and the day before it was announced that Gromyko was not coming because we, presumably, had violated our host country obligations. Now, that's not true at all.
Well, I thought we did.
We didn't.
I was proud because we did.
No. What we did was he wanted to come to the United States to address the General Assembly. We said, fine. The issue became whether or not he could come in an Aeroflot jet because of the boycott of these planes. In the first place, I just want to point out parenthetically that Gromyko in the past has never come in an Aeroflot jet. He's come in a military plane. But in this particular case, this became the issue.
A Soviet military plane?
Yes, he would not fly in a civilian airliner jet. He would fly an official Soviet government.
What is the
plane.
protocol for Soviet military planes coming to the United States? Do they land at McGuire Air Force Base? Or
well, they can also be serviced. These planes can be serviced at Kennedy or elsewhere. But in this particular case, it was made very clear by Governor Cuomo, Governor Kane of New Jersey, that they could not land. They were not going to violate for Gromyko the boycott of Aeroflot jets. The Pan American handlers were not going to handle the planes and service the planes, and there was no way that they were going to land. Now, our government could have said to them, "You can come in an airliner of another country. You can fly to Czechoslovakia or someplace, or go to Belgium and come in Sabena or some way." But in fact, I think rather generously, we said we would be prepared to allow a Soviet military plane to land at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. That, as Ambassador Lichtenstein rather sardonically pointed out yesterday, if that airplane happened to stray outside of its designated route and even went over sensitive military installations in the United States, we would not shoot it down. In any event, we were prepared to allow him to land and make everything perfectly convenient for him. He chose not to come, I think, for political reasons, because he didn't want to take the heat at the General Assembly, not just of the American people, but of many delegations of the United Nations over the anger of the shooting down of the South Korean airliner by the Soviet military air forces. So they came in trying to obfuscate the issue, as they always did, and said, "You're violating your host country agreements. You're not qualified to be the host country. The United Nations should not be located in the United States." And Ambassador Lichtenstein replied by saying, "If that's the way you want it, fine, leave. We'll go down to the dockside and we'll wave you a fond farewell as you set off into the sunset." This is the context in which he said it. In that context, I think it's perfectly consistent with what United States policy has been, namely we would not put any impediment in the way of member states or the United Nations itself if it chose to want to leave the United States. He perhaps said it with a particular gusto and force, and certainly he captured the imagination of many people in the United States who are not very happy with the presence of the United Nations in the United States.
Before we mention again, just out of courtesy, that Richard Grenier's book, Marrakesh 1-2, has earned some unusual awards from the Arab world and a very coveted award from our world. United free nations and let the others just go flounder. They are no good to us.
Barry, your position lacks consistency, if I may say so. I mean, on the one hand, you want to stay in there in this organization.
No, for one reason only. I don't want the
What
world.
interests are you protecting?
The only reason I want to stay in is tactical. I want to stay in and pay our dues because I don't want to give our enemies the pleasure of saying, "How do you like the United States?" As long as they could dictate United Nations policy, they were happy with it. But the minute we, the emerging third world, outvoted them, they got sore and they took their marbles and they went. I say, keep the marbles. Don't go, pay the dues, attend meetings of the World Health Organization, keep a carpenter, keep a gardener in charge. Stay there like Paraguay. But in the meantime, let us build a new organization in the image of what the UN was supposed to be, a parliament of decent democratic nations.
But what power would that parliament have? Actually, you
what
have a...
power does this one have? None
Well,
whatsoever.
this one has none. And in fact, in many ways, now Carl has read this, and I have read this because of this long, immense article I've been working on. for Harper's, but you know, the Secretary General of the United Nations has just turned out his annual report, and it is deeply, deeply pessimistic. He sounds worse than you. And you know some of the things he said in it, actually? Can I read you just a couple of the things? We are at present in a period when the value of multilateral diplomacy is being questioned, and international institutions are not functioning as they were intended to function. The machinery is running, the wheels are turning, but it is not moving forward as it should. He goes on and on and on like that.
Wait, forgive me.
All the wars in the world where nothing is happening.
You know those countries where they don't execute you, they're nice enough to let you commit suicide? I'm trying to think now. I'm tired, but I'm well. I'm trying to think of the name of the Secretary General of the United Nations. I'm okay. Don't be angry. Don't be angry.
P-to-C, they call him, right?
Okay.
P-to-C.
But nobody would have known him if it hadn't been for the Falklands War.
No, that's right. But anyway, he is deeply pessimistic about. He says last year was a miserable year since Carl and I first started working on this piece together. He says the fragmentation, we have witnessed the fragmentation and erosion of the historic effort to build an international system designed to provide peace. We are witnessing the unraveling of the agreement. And he goes on and on and on like this.
Yeah.
He said, well, of course, he ends with an appeal. We got to rah-rah for the team. We got to try a little bit harder. But he says the developments of the past year have been, this is all verbatim, I'm reading now. The actual developments of the past year have been far from encouraging. It has been a frustrating year for the search for peace, stability, and justice for those who believe that the United Nations is the best available international instrumentality to achieve these ends. He talks about a partial paralysis of the United Nations. He talks about the failure to he's the Secretary General. He can't say it's worth zero, but it's about as close as you can come being Secretary General. He lists the areas in the world where they've washed out completely: Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, Central America, Namibia, other parts of Africa, including Chad, which is one of the greatest shame, which is a straight invasion across an international frontier, and the Security Council did nothing. That's me speaking now.
See, the League of Nations was polite enough to disappear in embarrassment when it could do nothing about Mussolini's aggression against Ethiopia.
Well, the League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union when they invaded Finland.
Did they really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, but they were getting to be irrelevant, and that, in fact, P-to-C does seem to insinuate irrelevant.
P-to-C.
P-to-C, I'm going to call him that. You don't mind. That's what I call him.
Pedro de Cuellar?
Perez
de Cuellar.
Okay. P-to-C.
Yeah.
We'll call him P-to-C. He doesn't mind, will he? No. Anyway, P-to-C is about as gloomy as a man can be and be the head of that organization.
Well, Richard Grenier gives us the Marrakesh 1-2, and say again what I just heard before we went on the air, that the Arabs threatened nothing against you, but
they threatened to kill the lady who gave me a rave review in Los Angeles. That's because there are more Muslim Arabs out there in L.A., because they have a large immigrant community. But most of the people of Arabic-speaking descent in New York, out Atlantic Avenue, Brooklyn, are Christian. When I was a kid, we called them, Lebanese or Syrians or whatever. And they were, an important group, but they were kind of leaderless. And all these new Arab organizations, Arab American and stuff, has all been since 73, when we've been getting a lot of oil-rich people who've been coming in and provided them with a highly politicized leadership. Actually, they're I'll give you my honest opinion, and I don't think it's extreme. Anybody like Zogby, and when I say Arabs, I mean, I don't know if you know the names of Noam Chomsky and Jack O'Dell and people like that. I mean, they're not noticeably Arab names a lot of the time. They're actually a pro-PLO lobbying group. Would you agree with that? And
Yes. Yeah.
They're not actually an anti-defamation.
What about Anthony Lewis and John Chancellor and a few others?
Well, you have them too. But these people specifically wrote a letter, big legal stuff. Aberest is the former vicar of the Ayatollah Khomeini.
What? He was a senator.
He was a senator, and immediately afterwards he represented the Ayatollah Khomeini. I mean, these guys work for big oil money.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is absolutely straight. You can check it out. He was a New Republic, right? So,
well, Alex Parker gave you a big compliment. Alex Parker is a real estate man and a builder. A builder says to his children, look what I built. I always felt sorry for the demolition people. They can't point to a vacant lot and tell their children, look what I tore down. Now, Alex Parker, a lot of people have said, I went to a movie because of your review. Alex Alex Parker gave you the opposite comment. He said, I refuse to see Gandhi because of what you wrote. Isn't that nice?
Yeah, I don't know.
Isn't that nice?
I don't know, but as I just thought, the shooting down of the Korean plane did more to ruin the career of the movie Gandhi than even my wonderful book.
Did you really go? Did you really buy tickets and go into theaters showing Gandhi after the Soviets downed the Korean and count the house?
I've seen that darn movie 3 times. I saw it first in a press screening where I confess I didn't know. It's part, the great success. I underestimated the strength of the peace movement, so-called like the World Peace Council. I think everybody at this table, most people listening, know what I'm talking about when I say the peace movement. And I didn't know India. Well, this country doesn't know bugger all about India, So, by the way, my article kicked up a big stir in Britain because it used to be a colony of this, and it's such a pious fraud, this movie.
Gandhi, what a post-toasty. I always had that same feeling that if I were not 100% flaming, masculine, heterosexual normal, suppose I had a fetish of some kind. Suppose I like to pinch a woman on the thigh or something. I have the feeling that if I were to exercise that fetish, heat-seeking missiles would come in on me just spontaneously. How did Gandhi get away with the most outrageously flaming, distasteful fetish in the history of sexuality, and nobody mentioned it until Richard Grenier sat down in commentary and wrote his review?
Well, when people come from the West, there are a lot of things that they go to a third world country. People who are now very masochistic about our own society. As you might have noticed, I am not. I'm a hyper-jingo. But they travel around. The difference between me and them, by the way, is they don't go to countries like India and China and Russia and so on. I've been around. And I don't go like Billy Graham. They don't give me caviar and champagne. I go the poor way. And sometimes you see it a little bit better. Anyway, when they go to a country like this, there are some things that are so distasteful that they'd rather not tell their compatriots about it when they come home. And the stuff I gave you about Gandhi, you're talking about the enema fetishism and so on. I don't want to talk about it too much on the air. But this is...
That was the polite part.
Yeah, that's the polite part.
That was himself, at least, yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, this is just very well known. Anybody who writes about India, when you go there, the fascination with excrement...
You mean in India that's just common courtesy?
Well, I don't know if it's common courtesy. Any serious scholar who's written about India notices right away the fascination with excrement, Now, you're not supposed to talk about these things. Listen, the Arab world, the bulk of the Arab world practices clitorectomy on women, which is to say they cut off, okay. Now, most of the people who write about the Arab world it's such a disgusting subject that they just don't want to even talk about it when they come home. So without even wanting to tilt the news one way or the other, there are a lot of things about the third world that your average American doesn't know, because Americans who go there, they just can't get it into the New York Times, even if they wanted to.
But when a black tribe in Rhodesia was pinpointed as having the ritual, not the aberration, but the ritual of knocking out the front teeth of 14-year-old girls, and this was put in the headlines, that was considered racism to point that out.
Yeah, well, you have a tough time getting, if a white man, forgive me, I am actually literally colorblind. I judge all men alike. I've never discriminated against a man on the basis of race, creed, color, or I should say,
you're stealing all my material.
Nonetheless, I do notice that when a white man does something bad to a black man, he's in trouble. Whereas in Rwanda or Burundi, if the Tutsi whack out 100,000 or 200,000 Hutu, it really is a major effort to get it into the paper. And I bet you there are very few people listening to me tonight that realize that is not that's a fiction. A friend of mine went down for the Washington Post 10 years ago to do that story. 200,000, 2 months.
You could get it into the newspapers, radio, television, if you had an Israeli do it.
Oh, yeah. If you had somebody white.
Just one Israeli. No, not white.
Well, I think the Israelis are white. If they do it to a bit. But, it's very...
One selective.
Hold it. There was a reason why it was shown, of course. It was India's effort for the peace movement. And by the way, since my piece, the thing we'll get back, because India, of course, and all these countries we're talking about vote in the United Nations, which is what we're going to have to come back to. That's such a ruckus. every knowledgeable historian in the world has come in, to be really honest, on my side. All the emotional ecstatics who say this must be true because it feels
How could they not be on your side?
They had to be on my side because I had my facts right. They'd never hold me on the facts. Including, but what I particularly love is when I get an Indian, usually living in London, who'll come in and say, this movie is a pious fraud. This is the best the movie industry can do. God save the cinema. Yeah. Salman Rushdie, who won the Booker Prize, which is the prize the equivalent of the prize I'm up for this year in the States, said that people thought I was immoderate. Somebody said I was extreme. I suggested that they turned Gandhi into St. Francis of Assisi. He says they turned, he's an Indian, Salman Rushdie. He said they turned Gandhi into Jesus Christ, which is a blasphemous remark. In any case, there's been I've been largely vindicated by every serious historian. But the reason the movie was made is the reason that India votes the way it does in the United Nations, which brings us back to where we were.
What do the United Nations apologists now say? They used to say it keeps people talking, and talking is better than fighting. But people talked before the United Nations. If the United Nations became a smoking crater tomorrow, they would talk bilaterally, omnilaterally, duolaterally, trilaterally. There'd be all kinds of conversations through existing diplomatic missions that were there before the United Nations.
Well, Barry, I'll answer your question on condition that I get my point of personal privilege.
You do. You do.
I think that, look, the United Nations is there. It's an organization that was created by our country. It is an organization that reflected a certain point of view, and it probably still exists in certain sectors of the United States, but certainly existed very strongly after World War II. And President Roosevelt spoke for it most vigorously. It was a point of view which said that they were going to abolish reality, and they were going to create a utopian organization. There were many people, Barry, at the time who wrote very realistically about why this was a bad idea. They weren't really listened to. And I think that now...
they haven't been listened to for 30 years. They said the UN was a bad idea?
Oh, if you go back and read someone like, you may disagree with a good deal of what he says today, as I do, George Kennan, read what he wrote about the United Nations back then. He explained exactly why it wouldn't work. And I can go into that at length, but I think I would probably be a little bit too long. Or Hans Morgenthau, people who took a realistic view of power politics, balance of power, the realities of the world, totalitarianism at the time. And they said, you're going to set up an organization which is based upon false assumptions, that everybody's alike, that everybody shares our common assumptions. It just won't work. You just can't create a utopia.
The rationale for the UN is unfortunately a specious one.
Into a squabble. First, I'm going to quote George Kennan, as I was just saying off the air.
Mr. Containment.
Mr. Containment. Well, he's got a lot softer since now he's one of the four riders of no first use. The four horsemen of no first use. Anyway, I don't quote him very much. I'm going to quote him now. The difficulty of any negotiation, which is what you're dealing with there. Some people say, well, even the Security Council doesn't do much good, hasn't stopped a war yet. There are only about a dozen going on in the world, but at least they get to talk and so on. Kennan said that the difficulty of any negotiation varies directly with the square of the number of people involved, which is to say it is pretty hopeless to conduct. I mean, I'm not saying that they have never done they don't have any minor achievements to their credit, maybe even major. But I think that the people directly involved in any issue should get together in as small a number as possible. For example, if we were having trouble, and we are having some trouble with Mexico, the worst thing in the world would be to bring that before the United Nations, this alleged world government. We should meet with the people from Mexico City, huddle, as few people as possible, keep it as quiet as possible, and decide whether we're going to give money, not give money, and not bring in the whole world.
Well, the president's been
dictum, you see. They would never dream. But I'm just going to say, to take the reducto ad absurdum, is we would never, even if you might criticize the Reagan administration, he would never dream of taking any difference between us and Mexico to the United Nations. So which is to say that there's issue after issue.
No, but we brought the KL airline into the United Nations, and we felt that we wanted to get international condemnation of this action, and we actually, I think, were successful in even though the Soviets vetoed the resolution, we had 45 countries during that debate against 4 countries, which the Soviets could only get 4 countries to speak up for them, denouncing this act as a barbaric act. But I think there's more harm that is done in the United Nations than what is alluded to by Richard. In a sense, a much more profound and insidious kind of harm that is done. And that is the ideas that have been developed within the United Nations and by the states, ideas about international politics, which are ideas which work against peace and peaceful relations among states. The Charter of the United Nations, if one goes back and reads it, is not a bad document. It establishes a framework within which countries could live together in peace if all countries actually shared the principles of that charter. But what's happened in the UN over the past 35 years is that different doctrines have developed. The charter hasn't been changed, but different doctrines have developed within the UN, by the General Assembly largely, which have justified the use of force against states, particularly doctrines justifying national liberation movements, justifying aggression against states. And a whole ideology is developed within the United Nations, which, in a sense, puts the stamp of approval of the World Organization upon some of the very evils that exist in the world today. It certainly is silent with respect to human rights abuses in most of the countries of the world, which constitute part of the United Nations majority. It legitimizes the use of force against certain member states if they are pariah states, such as the state of Israel in one very important case. And it has been able to be used by the Soviet Union to mobilize an anti-democratic majority against the West and against democracy, and it's provided a forum for that. I think, though, the one corrective to this, though, is that the worse it gets, the more irrelevant it becomes. I suppose it does have a certain insidious influence on ideas, but also, as Richard was quoting the Secretary General before, the more these extremist influences and totalitarian influences dominate the organization, it can be a forum where certain talk can take place, but it is not able to have any impact upon actual events, and it has become a kind of side arena now in the world. I wouldn't exaggerate the importance of the United Nations, even though I do believe in the intellectual sphere, the ideological sphere, it has legitimized some very pernicious doctrines. The Soviet Union is not the way it is because the United Nations exists. What it can conceivably do is provide, as I indicated, a certain kind of legitimation. But I mean, the basic problems of the world remain. We have to deal with the Soviet Union as an aggressive totalitarian world power. And the illusion is to think that the United Nations somehow can deal with this problem, which it can't. Or even to think that the United Nations causes the problem.
Close it down.
Yes, because of the world.
I don't believe, in response to a question Barry asked earlier, who defends the United Nations and how do they do it? And talking about preserving the illusion, frankly, we look for people to argue with us at the United Nations. We've been making these statements in the United. My point of personal privilege, if I could come back to it, is the view that what Chuck Lichtenstein said yesterday was somehow new. It just happened that the press picked it up. We've been saying these things now ever since we got there. The very first speech I made in the United Nations was taking on the Soviet Empire. I had the whole Soviet bloc interrupting my speech, taking rights of reply to the speech, denouncing me in the most negative terms, and we got into a wonderful Donnybrook over...
Did they know you were a socialist? I hope so.
I don't know that they do that, although you would think that they have files.
They
know about
I hope so.
But we've been engaging in this battle over all these issues. I mean, the first thing we did in the General Assembly, we left our calling card, was when Ethiopia came and gave a blistering attack in the most crude Stalinist terms against the United States, and we let them have it right between the eyes. And our embassy in Addis Ababa got so scared that they moved their classified files to Kenya because they thought that the embassy was going to be raided over this speech that we made attacking Ethiopia in the United Nations. I'm just saying that we have been strong, and we have said these things, and you just haven't heard about them, I suppose, because they haven't been picked up in the press the way this was by Chuck Lichtenstein.
Well, we've heard about Gene Kirkpatrick. Hold it.
Yeah. Why doesn't the United Nations walk in the face of such repeated, dismal inability to do anything about what it was convened to solve? I want Marines to go with Jean Kirkpatrick to the university campuses where she was denied her rightful
diplomats
honors.
are never in the front line.
I'm sorry. I want Marines to take Jean Kirkpatrick back to those universities and get those honorary degrees that she was hooted out of back in June 19...
You know Bianca Jagger got an honorary doctorate?
No. Where Jean Kirkpatrick was denied one?
That's right. It was about the same week, too. She went to some college I'd never heard of, frankly. And, well, you know, because she's kind of the pasionaria of Nicaragua. And it was shortly after Nicaragua. I don't know why anybody was surprised that they did not vote to condemn the Soviet Union of the shooting down of the Korean plane.
Well, I think that was calculated.
Yes. Anyway, so they gave her an honorary doctorate, Bianca Jag. So congratulate yourself. Jean Kirkpatrick can't get a degree, and Bianca Jag got an honorary doctorate.
How can this organization continue? How can it survive? I mean, first of all, the fact that there hasn't been a world war explains it, because I think the League of Nations went out of existence with the World War.
Sure.
That
may end this one, too.
Well, then it would end perhaps other things as well. But, I mean, the fact that we have a kind of a nuclear stalemate in the world and there hasn't been this total conflict is one of the factors. But I think much more than that is the fact that I think if we were to walk out of the United Nations, and in your proposal for setting up another organization of free states, you should keep this in mind, we would be alone. We would not be followed by one Western state, in my view. You have to be at the United Nations to understand this, I think, because we are alone at the United Nations. We do not get the backup and the support from our Western friends.
I meant to ask, is there any myopic, sentimental, naive, delusioned Liberian? Is there anybody you've met in the line of duty who still has that warm and milky feeling about the United Nations?
Well, I mean, there perhaps are a small number of Americans who are affiliated with certain types of organizations that in one way or another are related to the UN. I must say that in all the time I've been at the UN, and we've engaged in a steady drumbeat of criticism of the United Nations, basically along the lines of some of the things Richard was saying before and some of the things I've said here tonight. I've only really gotten one person who was prepared to try to defend it. And we used to get into long discussions, and I found his defenses rather weak, but only one person. I haven't seen any vigorous or systematic, comprehensive defense of the organization by any delegation.
Right. Except we ran the United Nations.
As Hans Morgenthau pointed out,
in 1950.
Soon after the United Nations was created, the success of the United Nations was predicated on the absence of serious conflict. Because once you had serious conflict, you have the U.S. and the Soviets at each other, it's impossible for the United Nations to function because you have the veto in the Security Council, and you have the United Nations is paralyzed at that point. So if we had the world that the United Nations was designed to create, then perhaps the United Nations can function in that kind of a world. But given the world that we have, and the United Nations could not create that world, it was impossible for an organization like that to function. So it's just predicated on the existence of a different kind of a world.
But the other day, Tyrell, one of my favorite writers, Emmett Tyrell, he said, what are we going to wait for? We're going to keep appeasing until the United States becomes one unarmed commercial airplane.
Well, quite the contrary, is not giving a damn. As Carl pointed out, they've succeeded in legitimizing a number of doctrines that work against freedom.
Estimating the views of many of these countries, very often, especially countries which find themselves on the front line of Soviet expansion, have a very clear picture of the way the world is. It may be in certain instances, and given the fluctuations in American foreign policy over the recent years, they don't want to tie themselves too closely to us because we haven't been strong enough.
Sure, they have a clear picture. That's my understanding.
Why?
Yes.
Why?
Just figure it.
It's computed on the basis of population and GNP and so forth. Actually, I mean, according to the standards that they use, and we possibly should even be paying 27 or 28, but Congress indicated they weren't going to pay more than 25, and so that's what we pay.
What does the Soviet Union pay? Half of that?
Well, there are two kinds of payments, Barry. One is your assessed contribution. That's the 25%, where you're actually assessed 25%. I think the Soviets are assessed around probably a little under 12. But then you have your voluntary contributions to all those marvelous organizations that you were praising before. And that's a lot larger. I don't have an exact figure, but I would say it's about 4 times larger than the assessed contribution, which is approximately almost $200 million a year. And there we continue to pay about 25%. Interestingly, the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have 3 seats in the UN because they also have the Ukraine and Belarus. That's an old story. But the 3 of them together, in terms of their voluntary contributions to all these humanitarian organizations for refugee relief and health, pay a total of 0.41%. So the total Soviet contribution in the UN system comes out to well under 5%, while the U.S. is up around 25%.
Daniel Graham has chosen to spend this part of his retirement as director of High Frontier. Daniel Graham, deputy director of the CIA, once upon a time director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, graduate of West Point, veteran service stripes decorating his chest from Germany, Korea, Vietnam.
Do anything about it. And what High Frontier says is, let's get a defense up there so that if a whole bunch of missiles come at us, or even just a few, the president's got an option to shoot them down. And what High Frontier has done is to get together about 20 of the best scientists and technical people we could find and say, can we do that? How do we do that? And they found out, yes, in fact, we can do it. And as a matter of fact, we can do it pretty quick. And we can do it with a reasonable amount of money. We can put into space a system that actually fires pellets, like buckshot, at a rising missile. That's old technology. That's not fancy Star Wars stuff. And we can get it up there by 1990 so that the Soviets, if they ever did fire at us, would lose almost all of their missiles that they fired. But what's even more important, they would never fire them because they would never know what would happen. They wouldn't hit their, the missiles they fire would be destroyed. The targets they want to hit in the United States would not be hit. There would be no way they could figure what would happen, and therefore they wouldn't fire. So what we're talking about is a system that prevents a nuclear war. And it's cheaper than, say, you may remember when President Carter wanted to deploy a thing called MX Racetrack. That was 4,200 different places to fire missiles from, and you're supposed to move the missile around all the time so that the Soviets couldn't hit it. Well, that would have cost $60 to $80 billion, and this would cost 15, 20, maybe 25 billion. In other words, it's a strategic bargain. And what it does, it will finally get around to protecting our homes, our cities, our farms, the government, our armed forces from a first strike by the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. What we really need up there is enough satellites so that as they go around the Earth, there's always some of them covering those Soviet missiles, where they would come through the air and into space. And they've got to have a sensor on them that will say, here comes a missile, and here's where it's going in space, because you can, as soon as you track it a little bit, because it's like firing a bullet. It's ballistic. That's why you call them ballistic missiles. And you track its course through space, and then from the satellites, on each satellite, you've got 40 or 50 interceptor missiles that in the atmosphere, things like the Sparrows that we use off aircraft, hit another aircraft. But these are going from the satellite in space to that point in space where that big missile is going to come. And just before it gets there, it creates a big cloud of pellets, and down she goes. But what's really costing us more than anything else in the military these days, Barry, is that we have we introduced so much red tape into the acquisition of systems that it takes 3 times as long to get one as it should. And for every year that you stretch out the acquisition of an item beyond the time it would really take in terms of developing it and manufacturing it, you increase the cost of that item by 25-30%. This is what the government accounting offices said. Well, let me give you an example. When Dwight Eisenhower was president, in 1956, a bunch of smart young Navy officers came in and said, we think we can build a great big submarine, nuclear-powered, with a bunch of little missile silos on it, and we can fire those missiles out from under the water, and they will ignite after they get out, and we can locate that submarine well enough that it can actually hit something. Well, talk about a technical hurdle. Nobody knew how to do that. But they laid out this set of plans, and Dwight Eisenhower said, go build some. And 47 months later, the first Polaris submarine went down the skids. Now, in 1970, Richard Nixon, in order to get the Joint Chiefs to go along with SALT I, said, I will give you a product improvement, a better Polaris. It was called Trident. 13 years later, the first Trident went down the skids. It was first launched. Now, why did it take us less than 4 years to get a brand new, totally different technological item, and then take 13 years to get a product improvement at horrendous cost? Well, you tell me. Red tape. We've got an acquisition system now that simply stifles both the American genius in technology and the American genius for reasonably cost production. And that's much worse than, and actually causes a lot of the cost overruns. It's all of this stretch out of the process beyond what you need. Look, if you've got a factory and you're building military equipment, and they say, well, gear up, we want to buy 100 of those airplanes a year. And the next year the Congress says, you only get 20. Well, the poor guy that's manufacturing has still got all the people and machines and so forth to build 100. Now what does he do? He still has to pay for those people, still has to pay for those machines, and he's only putting out 25 aircraft. You just do the best you can. You don't know that a rifle or a revolver will work, if you have to use it. So you got to have some trust in your technology. One of the reasons why I prefer our approach to others for this kind of defense is because we use an awful lot of satellites. We use about 432 satellites. That's a lot of satellites. Some of the fancier technology, like the laser weapons and so forth, would maybe have a half dozen or a dozen. And the fewer pieces you've got, the fewer things that can individually do their business, the more risk there is of a failure.
Is it like a minefield? Like if I know the enemy has a minefield out there, and my sergeant says to me, don't worry, Barry, some of those mines are defective. Some of those mines might not work.
You're still not going to direct.
Exactly. Is it like that where if
Absolutely. Because with this system of satellites up there, Barry, the Soviet commander who thinks he might like to shoot missiles at us or our allies for that matter, because this system catches them on the rise and you haven't got time to ask them whether they're headed for London or Paris or Tel Aviv or Tokyo. You've got to take them as they come. So if he wants to fire a bunch of those things in anger, and you've got that satellite system up there, you might be biting your nails because, good Lord, I've got about 10% of my satellites, I'm not sure they're going to work. But he's got to figure they're all going to work. And he's deterred. Barry, the bottom line is this. When you have that defense out there, we've got to remember that the reason for that defense is to make it impossible for the Soviets to first strike the United States. That is, launch an attack in the hope of knocking us out so that they can win a nuclear war. And if first thing they have to do before they launch their nuclear missiles is to fight through that defense, no matter how they figure out how to do it, you've changed the situation radically. It's much like, when General Grant used to put a screen of cavalry out in front of the Army of the Potomac, he didn't put them out there because he thought those Union boys were invulnerable to Confederate bullets. Nor did he think that cavalry could defeat General Lee all by itself out there. But it was out there so that the battle didn't develop in his own headquarters. And now the situation we've got now is the first thing you would know is here they come at Washington.
I get it.
Now, I had one guy who had defected he'd had too much. He was a scientist, and he defected in England. And he read the High Frontier Study, and actually in it are about 8 specific technical objectives we've got in there. And he came all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to find me and say, don't you know that the Soviet Union is pursuing every one of those technologies? I was glad he did. I knew it before, but it was on a classified basis. I couldn't be spouting it off, when he came and told me freely. And this man had been the advisor to the Politburo on the Soviet space program. In other words, he passed all the information to the Minister of Defense, Ustinov, for the Politburo. So this man knew exactly what he was talking about. And it's true. And if the Soviets had the shuttle, which is the best transportation system, and if they were able to micro-miniaturize like we do, you see, we put a pound into space and it does 5 or 6 times as much work as a pound the Soviets put up there. And it's the cost of getting something into space which is the damper on what you do in space. Mm-hmm. If the Soviets had those two capabilities, micro-miniaturization and the shuttle, they'd have my high frontier up there in about 2 or 3 years.
He was last on this program, and he interviewed the North Korean pilot who flew the Soviet plane to South Korea and asked him why he defected. And that North Korean said he was at an officers' club in North Korea, and on a beach he reached down, saw an interesting-looking food wrapper. It was an interesting-looking colored piece of paper he'd never seen before. It was a food wrapper from South Korea, a noodle wrapper. And there was one line, they speak the same language, South Korea and North Korea, but there was one line at the bottom after the ingredients that he couldn't understand. It said, if this package is ripped or damaged or any of the contents fallen out, no problem, give us a call and we'll rush a substitute package over to you. Well, that's not what they do for consumers in communist countries. And moreover, they had told him in North Korea the South Koreans were starving and they didn't have food, much less pretty wrappers to put them in, much less condescending things to consumers. He said maybe they've lied to us here in North Korea, and that started the chain of events, sparked him into eventual defection. Let's talk. You are going to meet the phenomenologists who are going to tell you after a nuclear bomb explodes what the world's going to be like. Movies, you may have seen the first, you sure haven't seen the last of them, and scenarios and fiction, and 5th grade essay contests on the unlivability of life after a nuclear war. I don't mean to be an advocate. I'm not a head cheerleader for nuclear war, but we all know good and well that the aim of these movements, at least the coordinated movements and not the motives of the well-meaning people who adhere to them for reasons that can range 189 different ways, the motive is to get us as a nation depressed, not really wanting to mount anything nuclear, defense, retaliatory, because it's all going to be hopeless after a blast.
They want to panic the American people into adopting courses of action that without panic they wouldn't do. In fact, with the system we propose, you couldn't kill anybody because the pellets that we use simply won't re-enter the atmosphere. They'll burn up if they hit the atmosphere.
Now, how about the Soviet missiles? So suppose you hit a Soviet missile.
Mm-hmm.
Does it obligingly burn up in the atmosphere, or do we have a nuclear explosion when it hits the atmosphere?
Well, first of all, there won't be a nuclear explosion if we get them when we want to get them, when they're on the rise, unless the Russians are crazy enough to arm their warheads while they're still over the Soviet Union. And that's very unlikely. If they had an accident, they'd drop nukes on themselves.
Well, wait, how can you arm a missile when it's... you can't sharpen the point of a bullet after you pull the trigger.
Oh, well... You see, to make a nuclear weapon go off, there is a small core that has to be dead center of the weapon, and it's usually beryllium to spark the reaction. And what you do is mechanically withhold that until, say 15, 20 minutes after you've fired the weapon. Then mechanically, inside that warhead, that thing is reinserted into the center, so then the weapon is armed and will go off.
All by remote from the ground?
Yeah, all automatic. All automatic. You don't tell it to do that. You build that into the warhead.
Wow.
All of ours are the same, because you don't want a nuclear weapon sitting around that could go off for some reason or other. So all weapons, unless they are about to strike their targets, are disarmed.
All right, now suppose you don't get them when you want them. Suppose you get them over Pittsburgh as they're headed down.
Well, chances are that if we catch them as they're coming back through the atmosphere, they will go off. They will go off.
In the atmosphere?
In the atmosphere.
How high up?
Well, our system catches them from 8,000 feet out down to a classified number, which is keep out range so they can't kill a missile silo, There's a certain distance you have to keep them away or they could kill a Minuteman in its silo.
Uh-huh.
And our ground-based system is all it is there for is to protect Minuteman silos. So if you hit it up at 8,000 feet or somewhere in between, and the thing goes off, you are going to have some heat on the ground, start fires. You're going to have some fallout, but you're certainly not going to have the fallout you would have had if that thing keeps on coming and hits the ground near a missile silo and kicks up tons of dirt in the air and radiates.
8,000 feet's a mile and a half.
Yeah.
Isn't that what they call an airburst? I mean,
Yeah, that's an airburst.
Right.
And the fallout from a high airburst like that is very small. It's far smaller than if it came on through. I've had a lot of environmentalists challenge this whole system on environmental grounds, and I keep saying, now, wait a minute. Think what we're doing. We're destroying missiles on their way to hit the United States. And if you think that's going to cause an environmental problem, then you don't know how to measure environmental impact. Because if those missiles come on through, then you've got yourself an environmental problem in space. But if you stop them, no matter, even if those things went off in space, your environmental impact is negligible compared to what would happen if they came on.
All right. The consequences of a nuclear explosion are blast, fallout, and radiation, or blast,
heat,
and radiation.
And radiation. But in the initial explosion, if you as a human being have escaped the blast and the heat, you're not going to get hurt by radiation. Because radiation is shorter range than the blast and the heat, in killing range. It's the big radiation problem is when a weapon actually explodes near the Earth, picks up a lot of Earth and runs it up through that radioactive fireball, makes that dirt radioactive, and then the dirt falls down.
I get it.
That's fallout. And if an explosion takes place in space or way up in the air at high altitude, or especially in space, there's no fallout.
That limits fallout.
Yeah.
All right.
And if you destroy a Soviet missile on the rise, which is what we're trying to do, a bunch of junk will attempt to fall back through the atmosphere. Most of it will be burned up.
What eats up the blast? All you have is 1.5 miles of air. You said there'd be heat on the ground.
Yeah.
But the blast itself would...
the blast damage is got a shorter radius than heat damage. That heat flash is the most devastating effect of a nuclear weapon. That's it'll set things. A 1 megaton weapon would set things on fire 4.2 miles away from where it went off. I mean, from the center of the fireball, 4.2 miles. Now, if it's up in the air a mile and a half, and it goes off, well, there's a lot less heat, but there's still enough heat to set things on fire, even if it's up that high. Blast, on the other hand, is constrained by the fact that you can only compress air so much, and it fights back and holds the blast, and then comes rushing back toward where the explosion was. So you get a big wind out one direction and a big wind back the other direction. And that does structural damage. Every missile we catch in space, we get none of those effects. The ones the leakers that get through that might be headed toward a missile site or something, we'll get a far less effect. But we haven't got perfection, and I agree with Churchill that there's a shorter way to describe the search for perfection, and that's paralysis. You've got to do what you can do. We do know that the Soviets have tried out the kind of mechanism that we require in the high frontier system. They've already tried it in space. As a matter of fact, that's the way their anti-satellite system works.
Have heard of the doomsday phenomenologists who say the world would be so chilled, the world would be a prune pit revolving crazily in its non-orbit if nuclear bombs... Well, no, I don't mean to poo-poo them. They may be right, but I don't know.
No, they're not really. One school will say the world will be a hot, burned-out cinder, and the other school says, no, it's going to freeze. But I was looking at one in Parade magazine just a couple of weeks ago. It starts out saying, and these are respectable scientists writing the thing, start out saying, well, the typical strategic nuclear weapon is 2 megatons. Well, the typical U.S. strategic weapon is 100 kilotons, 1/20th of that figure. And even the Russians don't have but a handful of weapons as big as 2 megatons. Their typical weapon is about a half a megaton. So here you are, a couple of orders of magnitude too high on the number of weapons involved to begin with. You're already 90% off in your calculations. The next thing that is quoted is a Swedish scientist, or a Swedish doctor, not a nuclear physicist, a Swedish doctor determined how many people could be killed if you took everybody's nuclear weapons and divided them up so that each big center of population got its share. Like Calcutta, Bombay, Jakarta, Tokyo, Shanghai, Canton, all got the best killing percentage of the weapons available. And then said 1.1 billion people would be killed. And here, these great scientists quote that. Well, that's preposterous. Think what that would involve. The United States, the Soviet Union, France, England, China, all getting together and saying, now look, boys, doomsday is such and such a date, and we will put so many megatons on Bombay, Calcutta, and so forth. You put yours on New York, Moscow, and so forth, to see if we can't possibly kill 1.1 billion people. It's ridiculous, but this is supposed to be scientific. Then they talk about throwing particulates into the air to blot out the sun, which would cool off the earth. And the amount of stuff that even with their phony calculations, with too many weapons of too big a yield, they put up about 1 million of the amount of particulates into the atmosphere that one volcano, Mount Mazama, out in Oregon near my hometown, that created Crater Lake, that volcano all by itself put 30 cubic kilometers of particulates into the air, and it didn't change the weather.